Talking about torture in Iraq poses an obvious difficulty. Where to begin and where to end? I mean, if we go back for the last 40 years or so, it becomes clear that torture has been pervasive. Brutal torture was the hallmark of repression under Saddam Hussein's regime that generated a state of fear. And it was characterized by the then UN Special Rapporteur on human rights in Iraq as state terror aimed at enslaving the population. Well, of course, the end of that regime did not spell the end of the practice of torture, and I think that is what is deeply troubling and what we are here to talk about today. Because after the invasion, of course, both of the main coalition forces were then responsible for torture themselves, but also for facilitating torture. And the images of Abu Ghraib in particular, I think, brought that to light, because otherwise this would have been thought impossible to believe at the time, and these images are still very much etched into our minds. But this does not only apply to the US forces. British soldiers, for their part, were also guilty of torture, and one of the most well-known cases is that of Baha Musa, who was beaten to death in Basra in 2003. And that triggered a major public inquiry, and another inquiry is currently underway, the Al-Swedi inquiry. And there are also calls for a broader public inquiry following from the Ali Saki Musa case to establish the truth of the more than 1,000 cases for which British soldiers were alleged to be responsible. But it was not only, of course, the coalition forces, but it was also the new Iraqi government that has reportedly used torture very freely. And Amnesty International published a report in 2010 where it details the recent record of government authorities, particularly law enforcement agencies and security forces. And it stated there that according to official figures by the Iraqi Human Rights Ministry, there were 574 allegations of torture in 2009 alone. And of course, the true number is believed to be much higher than that. The methods and consequences of torture that have been reported are depressingly familiar. Suspension by the limbs, putting plastic bags over someone's head to induce suffocation, beatings with hoses and pipes, sexual abuse, including rape, to name but a few. And of course, in a number of cases that are also well known, the torture was so severe that it resulted in the deaths of those tortured. And this practice has really been facilitated by arbitrary and secret detentions and a lack of safeguards and accountability of the perpetrators, and that applies particularly in the counterterrorism context. So we look at the history of torture in Iraq. I don't think it's an exaggeration to say that it's been inscribed into the body and soul of the nation. And this torture has an individual and collective dimension. By definition, torture aims to break the will and destroy the personality of its victim. But what is special about torture is that it's not simply ordinary violence. As a matter of international law, it's defined as inflicting severe physical or mental pain or suffering for a particular purpose, and that usually goes with the involvement of public officials. So it's really sort of a pernicious means to an end that is at the heart of the exercise of power. And that's what gives it the collective dimension, not only for the families and friends of those who suffer torture personally, but for society as a whole, because it sends a message of who is in power and how that power is being exercised. So I think if we have a record of torture like the one in Iraq, that by its very nature signals a failure of the lack of the rule of law and respect for human rights. And we've already heard the backdrop to that, the developments over the last 10 years or so, why this rule of law has failed to take hold following the end of Saddam Hussein's regime. So why does this matter? First of all, those who suffer torture, they don't simply fall victim to some misfortune. They have a right in the first place not to be tortured, but they also have the right, where they've been tortured, to receive justice and reparation for their suffering. And that triggers a number of obligations on the part of governments, that is to effectively investigate allegations of torture, to prosecute the perpetrators, and to provide compensation and rehabilitation for the victims of torture. So I think for government and society, reparation is also a means of showing that it takes the rights of its citizens seriously, and that it recognizes them as equal members of society. So that is the obligation to address allegations of torture where they've happened, but of course there's also a future dimension to address the causes of torture and to institute the reforms that are needed to stop this practice. So how should this be done? Iraq has, and that is quite interesting, has recently acceded to the Convention Against Torture in 2011. That's the most important treaty on the prohibition of torture. And that sets out in some detail what states should do. Criminalize torture, provide custodial safeguards, monitor detention facilities, have a proper system of accountability, and reparation for its victims. So it sets out the framework, what should be done. It's obviously that is very recent development, and it's going to be interesting to see how the relevant UN bodies then will monitor Iraq's conduct in that regard. But there's also a lot of international experience. If you look at the record of other countries in dealing with past legacies of torture, they, even though it's very mixed, there is some good practice that one can consider, such as setting up truth and reconciliation commissions, public inquiries, and also reparation for the victims of torture. For example, in Morocco, there were some efforts in 2004 to establish the truth of what happened regarding the torture and disappearances over a 40-year period or so, and to provide compensation for the victims. Notably not accountability, because with all these efforts, what seems to be the hardest is to actually hold the perpetrators accountable. But this is happening sometimes many years later, such as now in Argentina for the military dictatorships. So it's hard to tell how long it will take, but if the momentum and the will is there, both in the country itself and internationally, then it can work in the long run. But I think one of the biggest problems, and we see that already in the responses following the uprisings in the regions, in the uncertain transitional period right now, is that a lot of these justice and reparation processes are highly selective and heavily politicized. Meaning that whoever is in power uses these mechanisms to settle scores, but also to favor its own people. So you have very problematic narratives about who is deserving and who's not deserving, and also deeply flawed judicial processes to go with it. And that, of course, runs very much counter to the understanding of torture as a serious human rights violation, because it doesn't matter who you are. By the very fact that you suffer torture, you deserve reparation as a matter of right, whether you were formerly a member of the Saddam Hussein regime or whatever it is. It doesn't really matter as a matter of international law. In Iraq itself, the situation is not much different, because even though some steps have been taken, they are widely considered to be fairly flawed, and I'm here referring to the Iraqi Special Tribunal, the de-Baathification campaign, some measures of reparation. They were all, in a way, inadequate to deal with the root causes of the legacy of torture in Iraq. And I think what is the most notable is that there has been almost complete impunity of the perpetrators, and both on the Iraqi side, but also the British and American perpetrators of torture, with very few exceptions. And of course, I've already outlined what this should entail as a matter of international law, but I think one needs to go beyond it and look at the broader context and start asking some critical questions. Why are certain patterns of torture recurring again and again? Why has torture become such an entrenched mode of exercising power? What explains the failure to combat torture effectively, and what is the record of institutions and the rule of law more broadly? And thus the targeting of members of ethnic, religious and other groups, a lack of respect for individuals, particularly those who are different, and generations of violence, foster a climate where resort to torture is more likely. And ultimately, what is needed to generate the momentum to break this habit, if you like, of resorting to torture? So my purpose here is not to provide any answers, but rather to sketch out what the task is to address this legacy. And it's clear that there are no easy solutions, but what I hope I showed is that there are legal frameworks and experiences out there that can provide guidance if the political will can be generated. And I think for that to happen, what is important is really to listen to the victims and those with an experience of torture and human rights violations, to get a better understanding of why torture happens and what it does to people. And this is to build a culture where allegations of torture are taken seriously and are seen as an outrage, whoever the victim is, and do not constitute a grim and disempowering reality. And I think the motto of today's solidarity, Tadhamun, is a very important means of overcoming that, and a gathering like ours today is also a way to send a message not to accept these realities and to imagine, if not demand, a different future. Thank you very much.
Thank you.